Maybe your day didn't go exactly the way you wanted. Maybe there were things you couldn't control. Maybe something happened that stayed in your mind longer than it should have. Or maybe it was simply another busy day. Messages, people, work, noise, one thing after another. But for the next few moments, you don't have to think about any of that. Just slow down, take a comfortable breath, and allow everything around you to become a little quieter. Because tonight, we're going to step away from the ordinary world and ask a question that is almost impossible to make any simpler. Why is there a universe at all? Think about it for a moment. You exist. The Earth exists. The Sun exists. Our galaxy exists. Billions of galaxies exist. There are stars, planets, atoms, particles, space, and time. We are so used to all of this that existence itself can feel completely normal. But it isn't normal. At least, we don't know why it is here. We often ask how the universe began. We ask what happened during the Big Bang. We ask how the first stars formed. We ask how planets appeared. We ask how life began. We ask how evolution eventually produced human beings. But every one of those questions begins with the same assumption. Something already exists. There is already a universe. There are already physical laws. There is already space and time. There is already matter and energy. So tonight, let's step one level deeper. Instead of asking, how did the universe begin? Let's ask, why is there something for a universe to begin with? Imagine removing everything. Remove your room. Remove your house. Remove your city. Remove the earth. Remove the moon. Remove the sun. Remove every star. Remove every galaxy. Remove every atom. Remove every particle. And then imagine removing space itself. Remove time. Remove energy. Remove every physical law. Not an empty room. Not a dark space. Not an enormous black void. Because even a black void would still be something. Imagine nothing. And then ask, why isn't that reality? Why is there something rather than nothing? For thousands of years, philosophers and theologians have asked versions of this question. And modern science has made the question even more fascinating. Because today, we know the universe has a history. We can observe ancient light. We can study galaxies billions of light years away. We can reconstruct the expansion of the universe. We can study the particles that make up matter. We can investigate the earliest stages of cosmic history. We know more about the universe than any previous generation of humans. And yet, knowing more about how the universe behaves doesn't automatically tell us why reality exists in the first place. Maybe one day physics will provide a deeper answer. Maybe the universe is the inevitable consequence of some fundamental physical principle. Maybe our universe is only one part of a much larger reality. Maybe there are countless universes with different physical laws, different conditions, and different histories. Maybe our universe simply happens to be one in which stars, planets, chemistry, and life are possible. Or perhaps there is something deeper. Perhaps reality ultimately depends on something that doesn't require an external explanation. And this is where the idea of God enters the conversation. A theist might say, the universe exists because it was created by a necessary being. But immediately, another question appears. If God created the universe, why does God exist? And that question takes us into one of the oldest philosophical debates in human history. Does everything need a cause? Does everything need an explanation? Or can something exist without requiring anything beyond itself? And if something can exist without an external explanation, Why couldn't that thing simply be the universe? These questions don't have simple answers. And that's exactly why we're going to take our time with them. But before we reach the question of God, we need to understand something about ourselves. Because there is a strange fact about our existence that can easily be overlooked. We are observers. We are living beings capable of looking at the universe and asking why it exists. But we could only have asked this question in a universe that allowed beings like us to exist. And that creates a fascinating possibility. Maybe the universe doesn't look perfectly suited for life because it was designed specifically for us. Maybe we simply find ourselves in a universe where observers are possible, because observers cannot exist anywhere else. This idea is known as the Anthropic Principle, and it will be our starting point. From there, we'll ask what happens if there isn't just one universe. What if there are billions, or trillions, or vastly more than we could ever imagine? Could a multiverse explain why our universe appears so unusual? And if it can, does that actually solve the problem? Or does it simply create another question? Because if there are countless universes, we can still ask, why is there a multiverse? What explains the system that produces all those universes? And eventually, we will come back to the question we started with. Why is there something rather than nothing? Maybe science will eventually answer it. Maybe philosophy will take us closer. Maybe the answer involves God. Maybe it doesn't. And maybe the most honest thing we can say right now is that we don't know. So tonight, we aren't going to force an answer. We're simply going to follow the question, slowly, step by step, from our own existence, to the Anthropic Principle, to the possibility of countless universes, and finally, to the deepest question of all. Why is there a universe at all? Let's begin. Before we continue, let's make one thing very clear. The fact that we are here is not a small detail in this discussion. It may completely change the way we should interpret the universe. Imagine that you are walking through a desert. For hours, you see nothing, just sand, rock, heat, and then suddenly, you discover a small oasis. There is water, there are plants, there is shade, and you sit down beside it. You might look around and think, this place is incredibly suitable for me. And in a sense, it is. You need water. You need oxygen. You need a temperature you can survive in. And this particular location provides those things. But now imagine that there were millions of different locations across an enormous desert. Most contain no water. Some are too hot. Some are too cold. Some contain poisonous gases. Some are completely unsuitable for humans. And only a small number contain the conditions necessary for a person to survive. If you suddenly find yourself sitting beside one of those oases, should you be surprised? Perhaps. But there is something important you already know. You could not have been sitting in one of the places where survival was impossible. Your existence has already selected the kind of environment you are capable of observing. This is the basic intuition behind the Anthropic Principle. It sounds complicated, but the central idea is surprisingly simple. We should expect our observations to be compatible with our own existence, because we could not exist to make observations in an environment incompatible with our existence. Think about that carefully. You are not observing the universe from outside it. You are a product of the universe. Your body exists because the universe permits atoms. Your cells exist because chemistry is possible. Your planet exists because stars and planetary systems can form. Your species exists because biological evolution occurred. Your consciousness exists because an enormously complex biological system developed. So when you look at the universe and say, "How remarkable that the universe allows beings like me to exist," There is another question you can ask. What else could you possibly observe? If the universe didn't allow beings like you to exist, you wouldn't be there to observe it. And this creates what is known as an observer selection effect. The fact that we exist filters what kind of universe we can observe. Imagine that there are 1 billion hypothetical universes. Most are completely sterile. No stars, no planets, no chemistry capable of producing life, no observers. A smaller number contain stars, but no suitable environments. Another fraction contain planets, but no life. And perhaps a tiny fraction eventually develop life capable of becoming conscious. If you are one of those conscious beings, where would you expect to find yourself? Naturally, in one of the universes where conscious observers are possible. You couldn't wake up inside a universe where consciousness could never develop. So the mere fact that you find yourself in an observer-compatible universe is not automatically surprising. This is the basic insight behind anthropic reasoning. But now we need to be careful, because this idea is sometimes misunderstood. The Anthropic Principle does not necessarily say, life caused the universe to exist. It doesn't say, humans are the reason the universe exists. And it certainly doesn't say, God is impossible. It is making a much narrower point. Our observations are conditioned by our existence, and that means we have to be careful when using our own existence as evidence that the universe was specifically designed for us. Let's return to the desert. Suppose you find yourself beside an oasis. You might say, this oasis is perfectly suited to humans. That's true. But there are at least 2 possible explanations for why you're seeing it. Perhaps someone intentionally built the oasis for you, or perhaps there are thousands of locations across the desert, and you simply couldn't have survived long enough to observe the places without water. The fact that you're beside an oasis doesn't automatically tell you which explanation is correct. You need additional evidence. And that is exactly the problem anthropic reasoning introduces into the fine-tuning debate. The universe appears suitable for observers. But we are observers, so perhaps part of the apparent surprise comes from a selection effect. We are looking at reality from a very particular position, the position of beings capable of existing only under certain physical conditions. This idea becomes especially important when we return to the physical constants we discussed in the previous video: gravity, electromagnetism, the masses of particles, the cosmological constant, the early conditions of the universe. Some of these parameters appear important for the development of complex structures. If they were different, perhaps galaxies would not form. Perhaps stars would not survive in familiar ways. Perhaps complex chemistry would be impossible. Perhaps life would never emerge. The fine-tuning argument then asks, why do we observe these particular values? A theist may answer, because they were intentionally chosen. The anthropic response says, wait, we could only observe a universe in which observers are possible. And that changes the interpretation. It does not necessarily explain why the universe has those values, but it tells us something about what kind of observation we should expect from our own position. Imagine a fish studying the ocean. The fish might wonder, why does my environment contain water? But the fish's existence already depends on water. A fish cannot observe a completely dry environment. It can only exist where conditions permit fish-like organisms to survive. Now imagine that the fish concludes, the fact that I find myself in water proves that the ocean was specifically designed for fish. That conclusion doesn't automatically follow. The fish's existence itself creates a selection effect. The same basic reasoning applies to us. We are life forms. We exist under particular physical conditions. Therefore, any universe we can personally observe must be compatible with our existence. This sounds obvious, but obvious ideas can have surprisingly deep consequences, because it means we need to distinguish between two different questions. Question 1. Why do we observe a life-permitting universe? And question 2. Why does a life-permitting universe exist at all? Anthropic reasoning can help with the first question. It does not automatically answer the second, and this distinction is extremely important. Suppose there are countless possible universes, if most are lifeless, and only a small fraction contain observers. Then observers will necessarily find themselves in the small fraction. The observation becomes less surprising, but we still need an explanation for why the collection of universes exists. Why are there many universes? What mechanism produces them? Why do their physical parameters vary? Why does the underlying reality have the laws that allow such universes to exist? Those are deeper questions, and this is where anthropic reasoning reaches its limit. It can tell us, you shouldn't be surprised to observe conditions compatible with your existence, but it doesn't necessarily tell us, here is why those conditions exist. That distinction is often lost in popular debates. Some people hear the anthropic principle and think, science has explained fine-tuning. Not necessarily. Other people hear it and think, the anthropic principle is just saying that we exist. Again, not quite. It identifies a genuine selection effect, and selection effects can be extremely powerful. But whether they constitute a complete explanation depends on the broader model. Let's look at another example. Imagine a room filled with 1 million alarm clocks. Every clock is programmed with a different random time. Some ring at midnight, some at noon, some at 3 in the morning, some never ring at all. Now imagine that you walk into the room at exactly the moment one of the clocks rings. You might say, what are the odds that I would walk in at exactly the right moment? But now imagine that you only entered the room because you heard an alarm. You would obviously find yourself near a ringing clock. Your observation was selected by the event itself. The fact that you found a ringing clock is not as surprising once you understand the selection process. This is similar to the observer selection problem. We are not randomly sampling universes from the outside. We are observers whose existence depends on certain conditions. Therefore, our sample is not neutral. We are already filtered, and this creates a profound philosophical problem. How much of what we call fine-tuning is actually information about the universe, and how much is information about the kind of observer asking the question? This does not mean the universe isn't remarkable. It means that our perspective has to be included in the calculation. And this is one reason cosmological reasoning can be so difficult. In ordinary science, we often try to eliminate observer bias. If you're studying a population of animals, you don't want to count only the animals you happen to notice. If you're studying a chemical reaction, you want measurements that don't depend on your expectations. But when the subject is the universe itself, we have only one universe, and we are inside it. We cannot step outside and collect an unbiased sample of universes. That makes the problem fundamentally different. Now, there are different versions of anthropic reasoning. One of the simplest is often called the weak anthropic principle. Despite its dramatic name, the basic idea is modest. It says that our observations of the universe are necessarily compatible with the conditions required for our existence. In other words, we should not be surprised to find ourselves in a universe where observers can exist. There is also a much stronger philosophical idea, sometimes called the strong anthropic principle. Different philosophers use the term in different ways, but broadly, stronger anthropic reasoning can involve claims about the universe somehow being required to produce observers. This is much more controversial. And it is important not to confuse the weak observational principle with a claim that the universe was somehow destined to create humanity. The weak version is mostly a statement about selection. The strong versions become philosophical, and once we move into that territory, the debate becomes much more complicated, because now we're no longer simply asking, what can observers observe? We're asking, does the existence of observers tell us something fundamental about why the universe exists? Some philosophers have argued that consciousness itself may be central to the structure of reality. Others see no need for such a conclusion. For them, observers are simply biological products of natural processes. We evolved, we became conscious, and then we started asking questions about the universe. No cosmic purpose is required. But again, that interpretation doesn't automatically explain the universe. It explains the observer. The deeper cosmological question remains: why did the physical conditions exist that allowed the observer to evolve? This is where the anthropic principle can sometimes feel like it is walking in a circle. We say, the universe allows observers because we observe it. But someone can respond, that doesn't explain why the universe allows observers. And that's a fair objection. The anthropic principle is strongest as a correction to our intuition. It tells us not to treat our existence as though we were randomly dropped into reality from outside. We are products of the conditions we are trying to explain. But it may not be a complete causal explanation. This distinction becomes even more important when we introduce the multiverse, because the multiverse offers a possible physical framework in which anthropic selection becomes much more powerful. Imagine that reality contains an enormous collection of universes. Each universe has different physical constants, different strengths of gravity, different particle masses, different cosmological conditions. Most universes might be sterile. Some might collapse. Some might expand too quickly. Some might contain no stable atoms. Some might contain strange forms of matter. But perhaps a small fraction permits stars. A smaller fraction permit planets. And an even smaller fraction permit life. If there are enough universes, eventually a life-permitting universe could appear. And observers would naturally find themselves there. This is one of the most fascinating ideas in modern cosmology. But notice something. The anthropic principle by itself does not give us the multiverse. It only tells us how observer selection could work if multiple universes exist. The multiverse is a separate hypothesis. And that means we now have another question. Do we have good scientific reasons to believe that there are other universes? Could such universes be produced naturally? Could we ever test the idea? And if they exist, would they actually solve the fine-tuning problem? Or would they simply replace one mystery with another? That is where we're going next. Because the multiverse is often presented as the ultimate answer to fine-tuning. Maybe there is no need for a designer. Maybe there are simply enormous numbers of universes. And ours is one of the rare universes in which life happens to be possible. But there is an obvious problem. If you have one universe, you can ask, why these conditions? If you have 1 trillion universes, you can ask, why does the multiverse exist? And if you have an infinite number, the question becomes even stranger. Where did infinity come from? What physical law produces it? And why does that law exist? So perhaps the anthropic principle doesn't end the mystery. Perhaps it simply moves us to the next level. And that is exactly what makes this subject so fascinating. We started by asking, why does the universe look suitable for life? Now we have arrived at a more precise question. How much should we expect an observer to find themselves in a universe compatible with their existence? And the answer is, quite a lot. if there are enough possible environments. But that leaves another question completely open. How many environments are there? One? Many? Infinitely many? And what determines their properties? We don't yet know. So the Anthropic Principle gives us an important lesson. Our existence matters. It changes the probability problem. It warns us against treating our universe as though we were an impartial observer randomly examining reality. But it does not automatically tell us why reality exists. It does not prove God. It does not disprove God. It does not prove a multiverse, and it does not eliminate the mystery. Instead, it gives us a new lens through which to look at the universe. A universe that might initially appear unbelievably special may look less special if it is one of many possible environments. But if it is the only universe, then the apparent precision becomes harder to dismiss. And that brings us to our next chapter. What if there really are countless universes? What if our universe is not the only roll of the cosmic dice? What if reality contains an enormous landscape of possibilities, and somewhere within that landscape, one universe happens to have the conditions necessary for observers? Would that finally explain why we are here? Or would it simply create another mystery waiting behind the first one? In the next part, we'll explore the multiverse. And we'll ask one of the most fascinating questions in this entire journey. If there are countless universes, could our universe simply be the one in which life was possible? Or is the multiverse itself just another name for a mystery we haven't solved yet? Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the universe you have always known isn't the only one. Imagine that beyond everything you can see, beyond every galaxy, beyond every star, beyond every region of space we could ever observe, there are other universes. Not other planets, not other galaxies. Entire universes. Universes with different histories, different physical conditions, perhaps even different fundamental constants. Some might have no stars. Some might have no stable atoms. Some might collapse almost immediately. Some might expand so rapidly that matter never gathers into galaxies. Some might have completely different structures, and perhaps some might look surprisingly similar to ours. If such a reality existed, then our universe would no longer be the only cosmic possibility. It would be one possibility among many, and suddenly, the fine-tuning problem could look very different. Remember the question we asked earlier: why does our universe have conditions compatible with life? If there is only one universe, that question can feel extraordinary. But if there are countless universes, perhaps the existence of one life-permitting universe isn't so surprising. Imagine rolling a gigantic pair of dice. Once, you get an unusual result. You might think, that was lucky. Now imagine rolling the dice 1 billion times. Eventually, even very unusual combinations will appear. The more trials you have, the less surprising it becomes that one of them produces something rare. The multiverse applies a similar intuition to cosmology. Perhaps there are enormous numbers of cosmic trials, and perhaps most of them don't produce life. But we don't need to find ourselves in those universes. We couldn't. We would only exist in a universe where observers were possible. And that brings the Anthropic Principle from the previous part back into the picture. Anthropic reasoning tells us how selection could work. The multiverse provides a possible setting in which that selection could occur. But now we have to ask an important question. When people say multiverse, what exactly do they mean? Because the word sounds like a single scientific theory. It isn't. There are several different ideas that are described using the word multiverse, and they do not all mean the same thing. Some possibilities emerge from certain models of cosmic inflation. Some are associated with interpretations of quantum mechanics. Some arise in theoretical frameworks involving many possible physical states, and some are much more speculative philosophical possibilities. So we shouldn't talk about the multiverse as though scientists have discovered another giant universe sitting just beyond ours. We haven't. What we have are different theoretical ideas that, under certain assumptions, can imply or suggest some form of multiple universes or regions of reality. That distinction matters, because there is a huge difference between some physical theories have consequences that could involve multiple universes, and scientists have proven that an infinite number of universes exist. The second statement goes much further than the evidence allows. So let's slow down and look at why the multiverse became such an interesting idea in the first place. One important connection comes from inflation. The early universe appears to have gone through an extraordinary period of expansion. Inflation is a class of theories proposing that the universe underwent a very rapid expansion during an extremely early stage. Inflation was developed to address important problems in cosmology and has become an influential framework for understanding features of the observable universe. But some versions of inflation have an intriguing consequence. Inflation may not necessarily end everywhere at the same time. In some models, different regions could stop inflating while other regions continue. That can lead to a picture sometimes described as eternal inflation. Instead of one smooth cosmic event producing one universe, you can imagine a much larger inflating background in which different regions undergo transitions and become separate expanding regions. Those regions can sometimes be described as bubble universes. Our observable universe would then be one region, one bubble inside a much larger cosmic process. Now, that sounds like science fiction, but the important point is that the idea arises from mathematical models of early universe physics. It is not simply a story invented because someone wanted to avoid God. That is an important misconception. The multiverse was not created solely as an escape route from religion. Different multiverse ideas come from different theoretical motivations. And some of them became especially interesting because they potentially address problems in cosmology and fundamental physics. But there is a major caveat. A mathematical possibility is not the same thing as an observed reality. We have strong observational evidence for many aspects of our universe. We have evidence for cosmic expansion. We observe the cosmic microwave background. We observe galaxies evolving across cosmic time. We observe large-scale cosmic structure, but we do not have direct observational access to a separate universe beyond our cosmic horizon. That makes multiverse claims much more difficult to test. And this is where the scientific debate becomes complicated. A scientific theory becomes especially powerful when it makes predictions that can be tested. If a hypothesis predicts something we can observe, and we observe it, that is useful evidence. But what if a proposed multiverse contains universes that are fundamentally inaccessible? How do we test them? Can their existence leave indirect signatures? Could certain cosmological models produce observable consequences? Could collisions between hypothetical bubble universes leave traces? Could the physics of our own universe reveal evidence that it is part of a larger structure? These are questions researchers have considered, but they remain difficult, and that means we should be cautious. The multiverse is a serious area of theoretical discussion, but it is not an established observational fact in the same way that the existence of our own universe is. Now let's imagine, just for the sake of understanding the argument, that the multiverse is real. Suppose there are not merely billions of universes, but an enormous number. Each one has different physical parameters. In one universe, gravity is stronger. In another, weaker. In another, the cosmological constant is different. In another, the particle masses are different. In another, the conditions never allow stars to form. In another, chemistry is radically different. And somewhere, perhaps, one universe happens to have conditions that allow complex structures. Perhaps that universe contains galaxies, stars, planets, chemistry, life, and eventually, conscious observers. Those observers look around and say, "Why is our universe so perfectly suited for us?" From their perspective, it might look extraordinary. But if there are countless universes, perhaps it isn't extraordinary at all. It may simply be a selection effect. Most universes don't have observers. Only the suitable ones do. So observers naturally find themselves in the suitable ones. This is the core of the multiverse response to fine-tuning. It doesn't necessarily say, "Our universe was not special." It says, "Our universe may be special within the larger collection," and that is exactly what observers should expect. This is a powerful idea, but it immediately creates another problem. What determines the distribution of universes? Suppose there are 1,000,000,000,000 universes. Why those trillion? Why those physical constants? Why that mechanism? Suppose there are infinitely many. What does infinite actually mean in this context? And how do we calculate probabilities across an infinite collection? This leads to something cosmologists sometimes call the measure problem. If a theory produces an enormous or infinite collection of possible universes, we still need a way of determining how frequently different kinds of universes occur. Imagine a multiverse containing different physical constants. You might say, life-permitting universes are extremely rare. But how rare? 1 in a million? 1 in a trillion? 1 in a number too large to imagine? To answer that, you need a probability distribution over the possible universes. And we are back to the probability problem from the previous video. The multiverse doesn't automatically solve probability. It may simply move the probability question to a larger level. Instead of asking, "Why did our universe have these values?" we ask, "What distribution of values does the multiverse produce?" And if we don't know that, we still don't know how surprising our universe should be. This is a crucial point. A multiverse is not automatically an explanation just because it contains many universes. The details matter. Suppose a multiverse theory predicts that almost every universe has conditions hostile to life. That could make our universe interesting, but if the theory predicts that life-permitting universes are common, then fine-tuning becomes less mysterious. If it predicts that almost every universe has completely different properties, we need to know what those properties are. So the explanatory power of a multiverse depends on the actual theory behind it, not merely on the word many. And there is another fascinating possibility. Maybe the laws of physics aren't randomly assigned across universes. Maybe a deeper theory determines which universes can exist. Perhaps the constants aren't arbitrary at all. Perhaps they emerge from a more fundamental mathematical structure. If so, we might not need a multiverse to explain them. The universe could simply be one necessary consequence of a deeper theory. This is why the multiverse is not the only alternative to design. There are several possibilities. Maybe there is one universe with deeper physical necessity. Maybe there are many universes. Maybe there is some combination of physical necessity and cosmic selection. Maybe design is involved. The scientific challenge is to determine which framework best fits the evidence. Now let's consider a common objection. Someone might say, the multiverse sounds like a convenient way to avoid God. But that's not quite fair. A hypothesis should not be rejected simply because it has philosophical implications we don't like. The question should be, does the hypothesis arise naturally from serious physical theories? Does it make predictions? Does it have explanatory power? Can it be tested, directly or indirectly? And how does it compare with competing explanations? The same standard should be applied to the design hypothesis. We shouldn't reject design simply because it is religious, and we shouldn't accept design simply because the universe seems impressive. Both ideas need philosophical and evidential analysis. Now imagine a different scenario. Suppose you are walking through a huge forest. You discover one tree with an incredibly unusual pattern in its branches. You might wonder, how did this happen? One possibility is that someone deliberately shaped it. Another is that the tree grew naturally under particular environmental conditions. Another is that there are millions of trees in the forest, and one was bound to develop an unusual pattern. The existence of many trees changes how surprising one unusual tree becomes. But you still need to know how the forest works. What species are present? How do they grow? How common are unusual patterns? What environmental factors matter? The multiverse is similar. The existence of many universes could make our universe less surprising, but only if we understand the population of universes. Without that information, many universes is not enough. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire debate. Quantity alone does not explain probability. A billion possibilities do not automatically make every outcome likely. The distribution matters. The mechanism matters. The selection process matters. And our observations matter. That is why the multiverse remains both fascinating and controversial. It could potentially explain why a universe like ours exists without requiring intentional design. But it may also introduce enormous unanswered questions. And those questions become even more interesting when we ask whether different universes could have different laws. Imagine a universe where the strength of electromagnetism is dramatically different. Would atoms exist? Maybe. Maybe not. Imagine another where gravity behaves differently. Would stars form? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Imagine another where the expansion of space is radically different. Could galaxies ever develop? Again, we don't know. The idea of a multiverse raises possibilities that stretch our intuition, but we have to distinguish imagination from established physics. We can mathematically describe hypothetical universes. We can explore what happens when parameters change in equations. But that doesn't mean we have evidence that those universes actually exist. This is an important boundary. Scientific models can explore possibilities far beyond direct observation. But eventually, we need some connection between theory and evidence. Otherwise, we are no longer doing empirical science in the ordinary sense. We are doing theoretical speculation, and speculation can be valuable. Many scientific ideas began as speculation, but speculation becomes scientific knowledge only when evidence supports it. So where does that leave the multiverse? At this point, we can say something modest. There are serious theoretical frameworks in which some form of multiple universes or causally disconnected regions can arise. Some of these ideas are connected to inflationary cosmology and other areas of theoretical physics. But we do not currently have direct confirmation that an ensemble of universes exists. And even if such an ensemble exists, we still need to understand its probability structure. This means the multiverse is neither a magic solution nor a meaningless idea. It is a possible framework, and its importance depends on the details. Now let's return to the original question. Why is our universe capable of supporting life? The multiverse offers a possible answer. Because among a vast collection of universes, some were bound to have life-compatible conditions. And we naturally find ourselves in one of those. That is elegant, but perhaps the elegance comes at a price, because now we have replaced one enormous question with several others. Why does the multiverse exist? Why does its underlying mechanism exist? Why does it generate different universes? Why do the laws governing that mechanism exist? Why does anything exist at all? And suddenly, we have returned to the question from the beginning of this video. Why is there something rather than nothing? Maybe the multiverse doesn't answer that question. Maybe it answers a smaller question. Why this universe? And perhaps that distinction is important. The multiverse might explain why our universe has certain properties, without explaining why reality exists in the first place. Imagine finding a huge machine that produces universes. You ask, why does our universe have these parameters? The machine gives you an answer. Because I generate many different universes. That may explain why our particular universe has its properties. But then you can ask, why does the machine exist? And if someone says, the machine simply exists, you can ask, why? The mystery hasn't necessarily disappeared. It has moved. This is sometimes called an explanatory regress. You explain one thing using another, then ask why the second thing exists. Eventually, you may reach something that is treated as fundamental. Perhaps physical law, perhaps a multiverse, perhaps God, perhaps something else. Every worldview eventually reaches some point where it says, this is where the explanation stops. And that may be one of the deepest similarities between apparently opposing positions. The atheist may say, the universe or underlying physical reality is fundamental. The theist may say, God is fundamental. The multiverse advocate may say, the larger cosmic structure is fundamental. But in every case, we can ask one more question. Why? Why does that fundamental reality exist? And that question is where our next part begins. Because if the multiverse really can explain why our universe is suitable for life, we still have to ask what explains the multiverse itself. Maybe the answer is another layer of physics. Maybe it is an eternal cosmic process. Maybe there is no deeper explanation. Maybe the multiverse is necessary. Or maybe we eventually arrive at something very different. Something philosophers have called a necessary being, a reality that doesn't merely happen to exist, but could not fail to exist. And that is one of the ideas behind the traditional philosophical concept of God. But before we accept that conclusion, we have to ask whether the idea actually solves the problem. If God is used as an explanation for the universe, what makes God different from the universe? Why can God be fundamental, but the universe cannot? Is there a meaningful difference between saying, God simply exists, and saying, reality simply exists? That question will take us into our next chapter. Because we've now moved from, why is our universe fine-tuned, to, what if there are countless universes? And from there, we are about to move one step deeper. If there are countless universes, what explains the reality in which those universes exist? And if something must ultimately be fundamental, what should that something be? A physical reality? A mathematical structure? An eternal universe? A multiverse? Or God? We don't have to decide yet. For now, just remember where we are. We began by asking why the universe appears suitable for life. The Anthropic Principle showed us that our existence creates a selection effect. The multiverse gives us one possible framework in which that selection effect could operate. But the multiverse may not be the final answer. Because explaining why our universe exists is not necessarily the same as explaining why reality exists. And that distinction is about to become the most important question of our journey. So far, we've moved through a strange chain of possibilities. First, we asked why our universe appears capable of producing life. Then we considered the Anthropic Principle. Perhaps observers naturally find themselves in universes compatible with their existence. Then we went one step further. What if there isn't just one universe? What if there are countless universes? If that were true, perhaps our universe doesn't need to be specially selected. Perhaps it is simply one of the universes in which the conditions happened to allow life. At first, that sounds like a satisfying answer. But now let's ask the question that naturally follows. Where did the multiverse come from? Because saying there are many universes doesn't make the existence of reality disappear. It simply changes the level at which we're asking the question. Imagine you walk into a room and discover a machine producing thousands of different worlds. You ask, where did this particular world come from? And someone says, the machine produces countless worlds. Yours is simply one of them. Interesting. But your next question would probably be, where did the machine come from? And if the answer is, it just exists, you haven't necessarily reached the end of the mystery. You've simply moved the mystery from the universe to the machine that produces universes. This is one of the deepest problems in any ultimate explanation. We can explain one thing using another thing, but then we can ask why that second thing exists, and then why the thing behind that exists, and so on. This is sometimes called an explanatory regress. It doesn't necessarily mean an infinite chain is impossible, but eventually every worldview has to deal with the question of whether there is something fundamental, something that doesn't require another explanation outside itself. And this is where the concept of a necessary reality enters the discussion. Let's distinguish two ideas. Something can be contingent. That means it could have been different. Your existence is contingent. You didn't have to exist. The Earth didn't have to form exactly as it did. Our solar system didn't have to develop in precisely this way. Even our particular universe, if different universes are possible, might be contingent. But philosophers have traditionally contrasted contingency with necessity. A necessary reality would be something that could not fail to exist. It wouldn't depend on something else for its existence. It would be fundamental. And this idea has played an enormous role in arguments for God. The reasoning goes something like this. Things we encounter in the universe appear contingent. They come into existence. They change. They depend on other things. The universe appears to contain an enormous network of dependencies. So perhaps the entire chain ultimately requires something that is not contingent, something that exists necessarily. For many theists, that necessary reality is God. But now we need to slow down, because there is an important philosophical question hiding inside this argument. Why should the necessary reality be God? Suppose someone says, the universe requires an explanation, and then they propose God. You can ask, why does God not require an explanation? The traditional answer is, because God is necessary. But then another possibility appears. What if the underlying physical reality is necessary? What if the laws of physics are necessary? What if some deeper mathematical structure is necessary? What if existence itself is necessary? In other words, perhaps the word God isn't the only possible candidate for fundamental reality. And this is where the debate becomes much more sophisticated than the simple question, who created the universe? Because maybe the universe doesn't need to have been created in the ordinary sense. Maybe creation isn't the right category at the deepest level. Perhaps reality simply exists. But then we have to ask, why? And here we encounter a philosophical principle, often associated with the idea that things should have explanations. It is sometimes called the principle of sufficient reason. The basic intuition is simple. If something exists, there should be some reason why it exists, rather than not. Why is there a tree in front of you? Because a seed grew. Why did the seed grow? Because it received water, energy, and nutrients. Why are those conditions present? Because of the environment. Why does that environment exist? We can keep going. The principle suggests that reality shouldn't ultimately be an unexplained brute fact. But not everyone accepts that every fact must have a further explanation. Some philosophers argue that eventually we simply reach brute reality. Something exists. There is no deeper reason. It is just the way reality is. And this possibility is uncomfortable, because human beings strongly prefer explanations. Our brains search for causes. If a glass falls from a table, we immediately ask what pushed it. If a light turns on, we look for a switch. If a storm appears, we look for atmospheric conditions. If a universe exists, we naturally look for its cause. But our everyday experience might not tell us what the deepest level of reality has to be like. Perhaps causation itself is a feature of the universe. And if so, asking what caused the universe could be conceptually complicated, because causes normally happen within time. The cause happens, and then the effect occurs. But if time itself is part of the universe, what would it mean for something to cause the universe before time existed? This is one reason the question of cosmic origins is so difficult. When we say, what happened before the universe? We may be assuming that before exists independently of the universe. But if time itself began with the universe, there may not be a meaningful earlier moment. Think about the edge of the Earth. You can travel north, and then ask, what is farther north than the North Pole? The question sounds reasonable, but eventually you realize that the coordinate system itself has reached a boundary. There is no farther north. Similarly, if time has a beginning, asking what happened before time existed may be using the concept of before in a way that no longer applies. But this still doesn't answer the deeper question. It simply changes it. We can ask, why does this space-time exist? And now we're back where we started. So perhaps the universe doesn't have a cause in the ordinary sense. Perhaps it emerges from some deeper physical reality. Perhaps it is eternal. Perhaps there are cycles. Perhaps there are countless universes. Perhaps something like quantum cosmology describes an origin without requiring a classical cause. Or perhaps there is a transcendent cause that isn't itself part of physical space-time. Each possibility carries its own problems. And this is where the debate between theism and naturalism becomes genuinely interesting. The theist can say, the universe is contingent, so it requires a necessary explanation. The naturalist can respond, why assume the universe is contingent? Maybe physical reality is fundamental. The theist can say, but if the universe could have been different, why does it have these particular laws? The naturalist can respond, perhaps those laws are mathematically or physically necessary. The theist can ask, why does that mathematical structure exist? The naturalist can respond, perhaps mathematics doesn't need a creator. And then the theist can ask, why should there be any mathematical reality at all? And suddenly, we are no longer arguing about one particular scientific observation. We are talking about the foundations of existence itself. This is why neither side can simply point to one experiment and declare victory. Science can investigate what physical models predict, But the question of why there is a reality for those physical models to describe is partly philosophical. Now let's return to the multiverse. Suppose the multiverse is real. There are countless universes, different constants, different conditions, different outcomes. Our universe is one of them. Fine-tuning becomes less mysterious, but the underlying multiverse still requires explanation. Maybe the multiverse is generated by inflation. Then we ask, why does inflation exist? Perhaps inflation follows from deeper physics. Then we ask, why does that deeper physics exist? Perhaps the deeper theory is mathematically necessary. Then we ask, why does that mathematical structure exist? At some point, we reach a foundation. And the interesting thing is that both the theist and the naturalist eventually face this boundary. The disagreement is not necessarily about whether there is a foundation. The disagreement is about what that foundation is. The theist may call it God. The naturalist may call it fundamental physical reality. A philosopher may call it a necessary being. A physicist may describe it through a fundamental theory. Different words, but the same underlying problem. What is ultimately fundamental? And here we need to be careful with another common argument. Someone might say, if God created the universe, then God must be outside the universe. But outside is a spatial concept. If space itself is part of the universe, what would it mean for something to be outside space? Similarly, if time began with the universe, what would it mean for God to exist before the universe? Theological concepts of God often don't treat God as an object located somewhere in another region of space. Classical theology describes God as transcending space and time. Whether that idea is philosophically coherent is a separate question. But it shows why the statement, God was somewhere before the universe, may not accurately represent the traditional concept. The philosophical claim is deeper. God would not be another object inside reality. God would be the explanation of reality. But again, that creates a difficult question. Can something outside the physical universe be scientifically tested? If not, then we need to distinguish between scientific explanations and metaphysical explanations. A scientific explanation normally connects observations with testable models. A metaphysical explanation can address broader questions about why reality exists. That doesn't automatically make metaphysics meaningless. It simply means we shouldn't pretend that a philosophical claim has been experimentally demonstrated when it hasn't. This distinction is especially important in discussions about God. Science can tell us that the universe has a history. It can tell us about cosmic expansion. It can investigate the earliest observable states. It can test physical theories. But the statement, therefore God exists, is not itself a scientific measurement. Likewise, science hasn't detected God, therefore God doesn't exist, also goes beyond what the scientific method alone can establish. The real debate is more subtle. Which worldview provides the most coherent explanation of the total picture? And that includes not only physics, but also existence itself. There is another possibility we should consider. Maybe the question, why does the universe exist, has no answer. Maybe existence is simply a brute fact. There is something rather than nothing. Because there is something rather than nothing. That may sound unsatisfying. But perhaps reality doesn't owe us an explanation. Think about the laws of logic. We don't normally ask, who created logic? If someone asked, what caused mathematics to exist? You might answer that mathematical truths are not objects that were manufactured. They are abstract structures. Whether they exist independently or are products of human thought is itself a philosophical debate. Perhaps physical reality is similar. Maybe there is no deeper cause. Maybe reality is simply fundamental. And this possibility has an important consequence. If brute existence is allowed, then the theistic argument loses some of its force. Because if the universe can simply exist without explanation, why introduce God? But the atheist faces a corresponding challenge. If brute existence is allowed, why should we find the existence of a universe surprising? And if the universe is contingent, what explains its particular form? So both sides have philosophical costs. There is no free answer. Every explanation has to decide where it stops. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of this entire discussion. An explanation isn't necessarily complete just because it moves the question one level deeper. Saying, God created the universe, may answer one question. But then we can ask, why does God exist? Saying, the multiverse produced our universe, may answer another. But then, why does the multiverse exist? Saying, the laws of physics produced the universe, can lead to, why do those laws exist? And saying, reality simply exists, may stop the chain, but it does so by accepting a brute fact. Maybe that's unavoidable. Maybe every worldview eventually reaches something unexplained. And perhaps the real question isn't, can I find a worldview with absolutely no unexplained assumptions? Maybe no such worldview exists. Perhaps the better question is, which unexplained assumption is most reasonable? And that is a philosophical judgment. At this point, we have reached a fascinating crossroads. The multiverse might explain why our universe has life-permitting conditions, but it may not explain why reality exists. A necessary God might explain why contingent reality exists. But then we need to understand what it means for God to be necessary. A fundamental physical reality might exist without an external cause. But then we need to explain why that reality exists. And perhaps there is no final explanation accessible to human beings. Maybe reality reaches a point where the question, why, simply stops applying. But before we accept that, there is one more possibility we need to examine. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Maybe the deepest mystery isn't, why did the universe begin? Maybe it is, why does anything exist at all? Those sound similar, but they are not. A beginning is an event. Existence is something more fundamental. Even if we discovered exactly what happened at the first moment of our universe, we could still ask, why did that process exist? And even if we discovered a multiverse, we could still ask, why does that multiverse exist? And even if we discovered a complete theory of physics, we could still ask, why is there a reality described by that theory? That is the boundary we're approaching. The boundary between explaining events and explaining existence itself. And that brings us directly to our next chapter. We're going to stop asking how our universe became the universe we know. We're going to stop asking how many universes might exist. Instead, we're going to face the question that remains after every explanation has been pushed as far as possible. Why is there something rather than nothing? Not why did the Big Bang happen? Not why does life exist? Not why does Earth exist? But why is there reality at all? Could nothing ever have been possible? Is nothing actually simpler than something? Could existence be necessary? Could God be necessary? Could physical reality be necessary? Or is the entire universe simply an unexplained fact? That question has troubled philosophers for centuries. And now, we're going to sit with it. Because sometimes, the deepest mystery isn't hidden somewhere at the edge of the universe. It is hidden in the fact that there is a universe to begin with. There is a point in every explanation where you can ask one question further. You can explain a planet by talking about a star. You can explain the star through cosmic evolution. You can explain cosmic evolution through physical laws. You can explain those laws through a deeper physical theory, but eventually you reach something that exists, and then the question returns: why? Why is there something rather than nothing? At first, this may sound like a simple question, but the more carefully you think about it, the stranger it becomes. Because what exactly do we mean by nothing? When most of us imagine nothing, we imagine darkness, an empty room, an endless black space. But that isn't actually nothing. Darkness requires space. An empty room requires space. Even an empty universe would still contain space and perhaps time. If there were no matter, but space existed, that would still be something. If there were no stars, but physical laws existed, that would still be something. If there were no particles, but a quantum field existed, that would still be something. So when philosophers ask, why is there something rather than nothing? They are imagining something much more radical. No space, no time, no matter, no energy, no fields, no physical laws, no universe, no possibilities. Nothing. And now the question becomes almost impossible to visualize, because the moment you try to imagine nothing, you have already imagined something. Your mind creates a picture, a black background, an empty space. But true nothingness would contain no background at all. There would be nowhere for the blackness to exist. There would be no time during which nothing existed. There would not even be a during. And this creates our first major problem. Maybe absolute nothingness was never actually a possibility. Maybe something had to exist. Perhaps existence is fundamental. Perhaps reality could not have been otherwise. And if that's true, then the question changes. Instead of asking, why does something exist? We might ask, what kind of something must exist? This is where the philosophical concept of necessity becomes important. A contingent thing is something that could have been different. You could have had different parents. You could have been born in a different country. Earth could have formed differently. Our sun could have been different. Perhaps our universe could have had different physical constants. These things appear contingent. They don't seem logically required to exist exactly as they do. But perhaps reality itself is different. Perhaps there is something that cannot fail to exist, something necessary, something whose non-existence isn't possible. For thousands of years, philosophers have explored versions of this idea. And one traditional answer is God. The idea isn't simply that God is an extremely powerful object somewhere in the universe. The classical philosophical concept is much deeper. God is proposed as the necessary foundation of reality. Everything else depends on God, but God does not depend on anything else. That would provide a stopping point. The universe exists because God exists. God exists because God is. No further external cause is required. At first, this sounds like a solution. But now we have to ask a difficult question. Why is God necessary? What makes God's existence fundamentally different from the existence of the universe? A critic could say, you are simply stopping the explanation at God. And that criticism deserves an answer. The theist might respond, the universe is contingent, God is necessary. In other words, the claim isn't that everything needs a cause. The claim is that contingent things need explanations, while a necessary reality does not. If God is truly necessary, then asking what caused God would be like asking, what caused the number 2 to be 2? The question may misunderstand the category, but there is another possible response. Perhaps the universe itself is necessary. Maybe physical reality could not have failed to exist. Maybe some fundamental structure of reality simply must exist. If so, we wouldn't need God as an external explanation. Reality would be self-existent. And this is where the debate becomes extremely subtle. Because how do we determine whether something is actually necessary? It is easy to say, God must exist. But that statement needs justification. Why couldn't God have failed to exist? What makes divine existence logically necessary? Similarly, it is easy to say, the universe must exist. But why? Could the universe have been different? Could there have been no universe? Could physical reality have taken another form? We don't currently have a complete answer, and perhaps science alone cannot settle it. Science studies the behavior of physical reality. It can investigate what happens under different conditions. It can build models. It can test predictions. But the question of whether existence itself is necessary is more fundamental. It is partly a question about the logical structure of reality. And there is another possibility. Maybe nothing was never a real alternative. Maybe nothing is not a state reality could ever occupy. Think about a mathematical truth. Could the number 2 suddenly become the number 3? No, not because something prevents it physically, but because the definitions make it impossible. Perhaps existence is somehow similar. Perhaps reality has a fundamental structure that cannot simply disappear into absolute nothingness. But this idea immediately creates another question. What fundamental structure? Why that structure? Why those rules? Why those possibilities? Again, the question comes back. Why? This is why the problem of existence can feel almost like a philosophical loop. Every explanation seems to leave something behind. God explains the universe, but then we ask why God exists. Physical reality explains the universe, but then we ask why physical reality exists. A multiverse explains our universe, but then we ask why the multiverse exists. A mathematical structure explains physical reality, but then we ask why that mathematical structure exists. And eventually, we may reach the same place. Something simply exists. Perhaps that is unavoidable. Maybe every worldview contains a fundamental fact that cannot be explained by something deeper. The disagreement is about which fact is most reasonable to accept. And this is where an important distinction appears. There is a difference between, I don't know why something exists, and there is no explanation. Those are not the same statement. Our current ignorance does not prove that reality has no explanation. Maybe we simply haven't discovered it. Science has repeatedly shown us that reality can be stranger than our intuition. People once had no idea that galaxies existed outside our own. They didn't know that stars were enormous nuclear furnaces. They didn't know that matter contained atoms. They didn't know that space itself could expand. They didn't know that time could behave differently depending on motion and gravity. So perhaps the ultimate explanation is simply beyond our current understanding. But there's another possibility. Maybe there is no deeper explanation. Maybe existence is a brute fact. Something exists. But because something exists, there is no further why. That idea can feel unsatisfying. But being unsatisfying doesn't make it logically impossible. Human beings are explanation-seeking creatures. We are constantly looking for causes. If a door opens, we look for someone who opened it. If a tree falls, we ask what caused it. If a storm forms, we investigate atmospheric conditions. Our brains evolved to find patterns and causes because that ability is useful for survival. But perhaps reality at its deepest level doesn't have to behave like the situations our brains evolved to understand. Maybe there isn't always another cause behind a fact. Maybe eventually, we simply reach the foundation. And if that's true, the question becomes less about finding an infinite chain of causes and more about understanding what kind of foundation reality could have. Could it be God? Could it be physical reality? Could it be something mathematical? Could it be an eternal process? Could it be something we don't yet have a word for? We don't know. But notice something important. The fine-tuning debate we started with has now transformed completely. At the beginning, we were asking, is Earth perfectly designed for humans? Then we moved to, is the universe fine-tuned for life? Then, could the Anthropic Principle explain why we observe a life-permitting universe? Then, could a multiverse explain it? Then, what explains the multiverse? And now, we have arrived at, why is there anything at all? Each answer has pushed us one level deeper, and perhaps that's the real lesson. Sometimes, an explanation doesn't eliminate mystery. It reveals a deeper mystery underneath it. The discovery of galaxies didn't end our questions about the universe. It gave us more questions. The discovery of atoms didn't end our questions about matter. It led to quantum physics. Understanding evolution didn't end the mystery of life. It opened deeper questions about genetics, consciousness, and the origin of life itself. And perhaps understanding the universe won't end the question of existence. It may simply sharpen it. Now let's return to God. If God exists as a necessary reality, then God would not be one more thing inside the universe. God would be proposed as the foundation upon which everything else depends. That is a powerful philosophical idea. But it isn't automatically proven by the fact that the universe exists. We would still need arguments for why a necessary divine reality is more plausible than a necessary physical reality, or a brute fact, or some other foundation. And that is why the final part of this video matters, because we now have enough pieces to step back. We have considered fine-tuning. We have considered probability. We have considered evolution. We have considered observer selection. We have considered the multiverse. We have considered necessary reality. And now we've reached the boundary between science and metaphysics. The question is no longer simply, what does the universe do? It is, what should we believe about why reality exists? Science can continue investigating the physical universe, and it should. There may be discoveries ahead that completely change how we understand cosmic origins. But questions about ultimate explanation require another kind of reasoning as well. Philosophical reasoning, logical reasoning, and perhaps a willingness to admit what we don't know. Because the most intellectually honest conclusion may not be, God definitely created everything. And it may not be, science has explained everything. It may simply be, we have not yet reached the foundation. And that is not a failure. It is an invitation to keep asking. So we've reached the deepest question of our journey. Not, why is our universe suitable for life? Not, why does our universe have these constants? Not, are there other universes? But, why is there anything at all? Maybe the answer is God. Maybe the answer is that reality itself is necessary. Maybe there is an infinite cosmic structure. Maybe there is some deeper physical theory waiting to be discovered. Or maybe existence has no further explanation. We don't know. But now, we are ready for the final question. If science cannot currently answer why reality exists, does that make God the best explanation? Or is that simply filling a gap in our knowledge with a conclusion we cannot independently test? And if God isn't the answer, does science actually have a better alternative? Or does every worldview eventually reach the same mysterious boundary? That's where we're going next, because in the final part, we are going to step back from the entire journey. And instead of asking which side sounds more convincing, we'll ask a harder question. What can we actually conclude? Where does science genuinely take us? Where does philosophy begin? And does the existence of the universe really give us a reason to believe in God? For the first time, we won't simply follow the mystery deeper. We'll turn around and look at everything we've learned. We have come a long way from the question we started with. At first, we simply asked, why does the universe appear so suitable for life? That question led us toward fine-tuning. Fine-tuning led us toward probability. Probability led us toward observer selection. Observer selection led us toward the Anthropic Principle. The Anthropic Principle led us toward the possibility of a multiverse. The multiverse led us toward an even deeper question. What explains the multiverse? And eventually, we reached the question underneath all of them. Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, it's time to step back, because after following this chain of questions for so long, it can be tempting to believe that one side must have won. Perhaps God has been proven, or perhaps science has completely removed the need for God. But the reality is more complicated, and perhaps more interesting. Let's begin with what science has genuinely given us. Science has shown us that the universe has a history. It has shown us that space itself can expand. It has shown us that stars and galaxies form through physical processes. It has shown us that matter is governed by consistent laws. It has shown us that life changes through evolution. And it has given us powerful explanations for an enormous amount of what we observe. These are not small achievements. They have transformed our understanding of reality. But science has a particular method. It observes. It measures, it creates models, it makes predictions, and then those predictions can be tested against reality. That method is extraordinarily powerful. But it also has boundaries. Science can ask, how does gravity behave? How did galaxies form? How does evolution change populations? What happened during the early history of the universe? But the question, why does reality exist at all, may not be the same kind of question. It may require more than a physical measurement. It may require philosophy, and that distinction matters. Because when someone says, science hasn't explained why the universe exists, therefore God exists, they have made a logical jump. A gap in our current scientific knowledge does not automatically prove a particular explanation. We don't know something, therefore God, is not a valid conclusion by itself. This is sometimes called a God of the gaps argument. The problem is that scientific gaps can shrink. What once appeared mysterious can later receive a natural explanation. So if our belief in God depends entirely on whatever science hasn't explained yet, that belief becomes vulnerable to every future scientific discovery. But there is another mistake on the opposite side. Someone might say, science can explain many natural processes, therefore God does not exist. That conclusion also goes beyond the evidence. The existence of a natural mechanism does not logically demonstrate that reality has no deeper purpose. A person can believe that evolution occurred and still believe God exists. A person can believe the universe has physical laws and still believe those laws ultimately depend on a divine foundation. Whether that belief is justified is another question. But science alone does not automatically settle it. So we have to distinguish between two different ideas. Scientific explanation and ultimate explanation. A scientific explanation might tell us how something happens. An ultimate explanation asks why there is a reality in which that process can happen at all. These questions can overlap, but they are not identical. Consider evolution. Evolution explains how populations change. It explains adaptation. It explains how complex biological structures can develop through natural selection. But evolution doesn't answer why there are physical laws capable of supporting chemistry. That is a different question. Likewise, cosmology can describe the evolution of the early universe. But even a complete description of the universe's earliest physical state wouldn't automatically answer why that state exists. And even if we discovered a multiverse, we could still ask why the multiverse exists. So perhaps we should stop expecting every explanation to be the final explanation. Maybe reality is layered. One explanation can answer one question, while revealing another question underneath it. And this brings us back to God. Does the existence of the universe prove God? No. Does fine-tuning prove God? No. Does the multiverse disprove God? Number. Does evolution disprove God? Number. Does science prove that God does not exist? Not in any simple sense. But does that mean all explanations are equally good? Also no. We can still compare them. We can ask whether an explanation is logically coherent. We can ask whether it introduces unnecessary assumptions. We can ask whether it makes predictions. We can ask whether it explains more than it assumes. And we can ask whether the explanation can actually be investigated. This is where the debate becomes philosophical. The theist might say, the universe appears contingent. Contingent reality requires an explanation. Therefore, there must be some necessary foundation. And that foundation is God. The naturalist might respond, perhaps reality itself is fundamental. Perhaps there is no need for a supernatural foundation. Perhaps the universe, or some deeper physical reality, simply exists. The multiverse advocate might say, our universe is only one region within a much larger physical reality. The apparent fine-tuning can then be explained through selection. And another philosopher might respond, even if the multiverse exists, why does the multiverse exist? Every position has a strength, and every position has a difficult question waiting behind it. This is why intellectual honesty matters. We should be able to say, this is what we know. This is what we strongly suspect. This is what remains uncertain. And this is where I am making a philosophical interpretation. Those are different levels of confidence. And perhaps the most important lesson from our entire discussion is that uncertainty isn't the same thing as ignorance. We know an enormous amount about the universe, but knowing a great deal does not mean knowing everything. There are still enormous unanswered questions. What happened at the earliest meaningful stage of cosmic history? Why do the fundamental constants have their observed values? Why does the universe have the laws it has? Is there a multiverse? Is there some deeper physical theory? How did the first life emerge? How did consciousness arise? And underneath all of them, why does reality exist at all? These questions are not evidence that science has failed. Quite the opposite. They show us how much there is left to understand. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part. Humanity began by looking at the sky with almost no understanding of what it was seeing. Today, we can measure galaxies billions of light years away. We can detect ancient radiation from the early universe. We can identify elements in stars. We can read genetic information. We can reconstruct evolutionary history. We can build mathematical models of cosmic evolution. And yet, after all of that progress, we can still look upward and ask, why? Maybe one day we'll have an answer. Maybe science will discover a deeper theory that changes everything. Maybe the universe will turn out to be mathematically necessary. Maybe a multiverse will become testable. Maybe some completely unexpected idea will replace the frameworks we currently use. Or maybe the final answer will remain beyond our reach. And perhaps there is something deeply human about that. We are creatures inside the universe, trying to understand the universe, using brains that evolved within the universe. We're not standing outside reality with a perfect view. We're trying to understand the whole from inside the whole. That should make us humble. So, does the universe prove God? Number, does science disprove God? No. Does fine-tuning make the existence of God a reasonable philosophical possibility? For many people, yes. Does the existence of natural explanations make belief in God unnecessary for others? For many people, yes. And neither side can simply end the conversation with a slogan. Because the deepest disagreement isn't really about whether stars exist. We agree that they do. It isn't about whether evolution happens. The scientific evidence for evolution is enormous. It isn't even simply about whether the universe has a history. We have strong evidence that it does. The deeper disagreement is about interpretation. What does all of this ultimately mean? Does an ordered universe point toward a mind? Or can order arise naturally from fundamental laws? Does apparent fine-tuning indicate intention? Or is it the result of selection among possibilities? Does existence require a necessary foundation? Or can reality simply be fundamental? Those questions remain open, and perhaps that is where we should leave them. Not because there are no arguments. There are. Not because evidence is irrelevant. It isn't. But because the evidence does not currently force one single metaphysical conclusion upon everyone. You may look at the universe and see intention. Someone else may look at exactly the same universe and see natural law. Another person may see an unresolved mystery, and perhaps all three are responding to different aspects of the same reality. So tonight, you don't need to choose a side. You don't need to become a believer. You don't need to become an atheist. You don't need to pretend that you know the ultimate answer. You can simply remain curious. Because curiosity is where this entire journey began. We looked at the universe and asked why. And that question is still there. Maybe the universe was designed. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe there are countless universes. Maybe there is only one. Maybe reality is necessary. Maybe reality is contingent. Maybe God exists. Maybe the ultimate foundation of reality is something we haven't even learned how to describe. We don't know. But we do know something extraordinary. We are here. On one small planet, around one ordinary star, inside one galaxy among an unimaginable number of galaxies, and somehow, the universe has produced beings capable of asking why the universe exists. You are made from atoms that were forged through cosmic history. Your body is part of nature. Your mind is part of nature. Your questions are part of nature. And when you look toward the night sky, you are not looking at something completely separate from yourself. You are looking at the same universe that produced you. The same universe that produced the stars, the planets, the elements, life, and eventually consciousness. Perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not simply that the universe exists, but that a small part of the universe became capable of wondering about its own existence. So, the next time you look at the stars, don't feel that you have to immediately explain them. Just look. Let the question remain for a while. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why these laws? Why this universe? Why life? Why consciousness? And perhaps, why us? We may not have the final answers, but the questions are worth asking. Because every answer we discover seems to open another door, and perhaps that's what science and philosophy have always been doing together. not giving us a final place to stop, but teaching us how to ask better questions. For now, let the universe remain vast, let the mystery remain, and let yourself simply wonder, because sometimes not knowing the final answer is not the end of the journey. It is the reason the journey continues.